Hello, podcast listener. Sit back. If you've got a log in your house, you're going to want to sit in that because this is the type of podcast we've got going on today. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this deep dive into the old mill on JJ Meets World. And by the way, if you'd like to help support our podcast, visit jjmeetsworld.com where you can donate to our Patreon, pick up some killer swag at our merch shop, or click the link to Apple Podcast and give us a 5-star review.
1, 2, 3, 4. J.J. Gordon, sort of like that Indiana Jones, in that he's always sniffing out his next adventure. Yes, he is. He's always interviewing guests so he can have them on his show and they can talk about pop culture, arts, and leisure. J.J. has his flag unfurled and he likes his french fries curled, and he's fun and then he twirled as he goes to meet the world. He will march into the rain even if his ankle sprained. Take a peek inside his brain. This podcast is called J.J. Meets World.
Tucker.
That's me.
That's you. I want to talk about the old mill, specifically at Kennywood Amusement Park. Now, I fell into a small rabbit hole that led to hours and hours. I stayed up until 2 o'clock in the morning watching and reading stuff off of both YouTube and Wikipedia.
Okay, so you're primed to talk about a topic I've now heard of for the very first time,
and
because you prefaced before we started recording, Tucker, I have a really good subject today.
I got something good. Okay, so here's what you need to understand about Kennywood, okay? So picnics became popular in the United States at the end of the 1800s. Picnics were not something that were really done. It was a European fashion, but Americans didn't take a basket and go and sit by the riverside. It just wasn't in fashion until the end of the 1800s when it boomed. It boomed so much that picnics became the thing that, you know, not only were, you know, if you wanted to court a young lady, you'd invite her to a picnic, and it wasn't salacious because you were outside and there were other people picnicking in that area. But people like railroad tycoons said there's money to be made in picnics. So they started making these railway lines that just went to one spot and back. So it didn't even turn around. The train literally would go there and then would reverse all the way back. And these were like called trolley parks. So you'd get on the trolley, a.k.a. the train, and you'd ride it out there, and it was to a scenic area that would be hard to get to because there weren't paths and roads and things like that made for it. So Kennywood specifically is outside of Pittsburgh. The park opened on May 30th, 1898 as a trolley park, but it had been used for several years before that as just a picnic spot.
Okay.
So the picnic spot is a big thing, but they we need something else to maybe get more families out here. So they add a carousel out there. And, at that point it's a steam powered carousel, right? Like someone is throwing logs into this to make it go around in circles because there's no electricity for them.
Right.
So at the end of the...
Would a ride go for as long as that log would sustain it, and then it would just be like, hey,
peter out?
Log's done, so you get off the horses. Next people on the horses will put a new log in.
No, there'd be a working class person whose job it would be to do that. They probably were the first to ride out in the trolley in the morning and the last to ride back. Because you're also, not just the log, steam requires water, so you're probably bringing water in from the river so that you could enjoy that. So... they add the carousel, and by 1906, they have decided that they're going to, they add some bridges and things like that, and they decide this is going to be a place for amusement. And they add a ride called the Old Mill, and it was patterned after a sawmill. So it is what we would consider now like a log ride, like a log flume, but there's no drop, okay? So essentially you have a metal river that you've made, and you get inside a small boat, and there's a current that takes you along that's powered by an actual mill, like a water paddle mill.
Okay.
So the pace is never the same. You just get in this little boat, and there's two of you in the boat, and the boat goes along. Sometimes if the current wasn't big enough or there wasn't enough water, you'd all get jammed up at one point. But the interesting thing about the old mill specifically is half of it takes place inside of where the old sawmill used to be. So you're inside of a building that has no lighting whatsoever. It's just darkness. And people, they started canoodling. And the old mill becomes the basis for what we would know in the modern era as the Tunnel of Love.
Okay.
And in fact, some people nicknamed it at that time. So,
and just the idea being that you're in this little raft that's tethered to, so you're not having to control it.
Yep.
Right? And you're with your honey.
Yep.
Your sweetheart.
Mm-hmm.
And then when at one point there's so little light that other people in their logs can't see you.
Correct.
Giving you privacy to have a couple of smooches for as long as it's dark.
Right. And also the thrill of knowing that there are other, I mean, you could hear probably the other people in front of you and behind you, right? And it's also families are also riding it, right? Like little kids are riding it. But it becomes a place known for not, and like we're talking about like 1906, like kissing and stuff like that. In fact, a woman in the 1980s described going on this ride in the 30s and how it was popular at the time for young men to bring a small piece of string and they would run it across the back of the neck of the ladies and insist that it must be spiders or some kind of water snake. And so if they want to be protected, they can cuddle in a little closer, which, by the way, I've read a lot of books on coupling up, and I have never heard of the string trick. I'm going to put it into fashion. I'm going to try that on Jill.
Try it in a movie theater.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, is that a water snake?
Okay, so the government gets involved because there's so much.
They're cracking down?
They're cracking down. Because at one point, they're like, this is incredibly inappropriate for what's taking place.
How far are people going with this?
So that's the thing. By the 60s, they now hide employees at various parts in the old mill with a flashlight and a plastic baseball bat. And they are told if you see a bare ass, to smack the ass with the plastic baseball bat and tell them to knock it off. And it happened constantly. So much so that people actually made a pilgrimage to the old mill because they were like, we want to get busy in the old mill.
And we want to get spanked with a plastic bat
right.
by a stranger because we're being naughty.
We're being naughty.
How much time is there to spend in this? Like, I would assume it only takes about a minute to get through it.
No. It takes, I mean, it's a full-size log mill. So you're talking about a ride that lasts like upwards of 10 minutes. Right.
Okay.
So, but
even so,
people what they would do is they would put their arms out and stop. Like if you're the lead boat, if you're the first boat, you would stop your boat, and then all the other ones, dung, 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 would build up behind you in sort of this room of ill repute. So
of lovemaking.
Yes.
It's lovemaking.
At one point they, like, some local municipality people, like probably an alderman or a councilman, says this is inappropriate. We know what people are doing. They're going there to, be salacious. Second time I've used that term in this podcast. I've probably never said that word before, and now I've got it twice in one episode. So what they decided to do was they take down some of the inner walls of the old mill, but now you're just looking out at nothing, not even like the forest, because the old mill kind of circles around on itself. So they decide they're going to theme it. So they put old Western stuff. They decide they're going to make this a scary ride, right? Like this is going to become terrifying. So they put skeletons of old horses, like taking buggies along, and they make it this scary old West theme.
When what year was this roughly?
This is like the 1940s when they finally get around to it.
Okay, so wartime.
Yes, exactly, right? At one point, the old mill burns, and so they just rebuild it the exact same way it was and get going with this. It does not stop people from getting the freak on at all. In fact, now it's kind of fun because, oh, look, skeletons. Skeletons. Let's kiss every time we see a skeleton. But this becomes, by a lot of standards, the United States' first dark ride. it defines what a dark ride is, which is usually some kind of a moving conveyor that takes place in a building themed around something that takes you from point A to point B. Okay. And like at this point, by the 60s, it is there are versions of the old mill like all over the place, places that actually call it the Tunnel of Love, and like are like, yeah, we know you're gonna go in here and you're gonna cop a feel. And it becomes something that just like gets more and more famous across the world, to the point of where like even Disney notices this. And It's a Small World and Pirates of the Caribbean are both based off of this log flume ride, right? And at one point they're like, oh, what if we do the same thing but treat it like a roller coaster? So there's like the drop. But most of these are just, you are propelled by the current of the water. And so most of the time the rides aren't breaking down. I mean, there's maintenance required because you're in a boat, but like there's not a lot of other stuff that you have to worry about. Another thing I should note is that it was not uncommon for a boat to return empty. Which means that there were certain parts that people knew of where you could hop off and have a tryst and be able to still walk out. I watch a YouTube series called Defunct Land where they do like a retrospective on rides that are no longer around. It's really good. I mean, it's well worth your time to watch it. And in the one, he talked about the old mill. And we're not even done with like the most messed up part of this thing, okay? In the old mill episode, he posted on his Twitter account, his X account, did anyone ride the old mill? Would you tell me where you got off? And then he had to rewrite it. And he goes, not that kind of got off, like where you would hop off the ride.
You would disembark.
Yeah.
Or is that when you leave on the boat? Is disembarking when you leave on the boat?
Both. I think it's both.
Is it both?
Is it embark? Do you embark when you get on a boat and you disembark when you get off a boat?
I don't know.
Embark?
Yeah.
Dunbark? Dunbark is a good name for a character. Roger Dunbark. My wheels are spinning.
You went on a little journey there.
I did. So his email gets flooded with people who talk about their experiences. He goes, and so what he does is in this thing, he has these really quick flashes of the emails. He goes, you'll have to pause it to read this, but I've blurred out information and anything that's over the top. And there's a lot of blurring. In fact, there's one whole thing where he's had to blur the entire thing, except for the last one, who's like, yeah, it was great.
Man, get rid of that censorship. Let's see. Show us the truth.
Right. Well, I mean, and this is a guy, like his previous episode of this was Berenstain Bears, like family farm at Knott's Berry. So, okay. So the old mill is still it's got a history to it. And at one point they name it something so stupid. And hold on, I need to tell you the whole name of it because it is ridiculous. Like at one point you're like, who made that stupid name for this thing? Because it was, okay, hold on. I know. Hold on one second. Flat rides, and that's not what it is. Come on. Kangaroo. By the way, Kennywood becomes like an institution. Like if you live in Pittsburgh, this is a place that you went on field trips. This is a place that you went to on a regular basis for just like birthday parties and stuff like that.
And
the
name Kennywood itself?
Yes.
Where's that come from?
Kennywood, so it's the Kenny family.
Okay.
And then it was a wooded area. Kennywood.
I thought it was like, like maybe like Graceland, but for Kenny Rogers.
Oh, you wish. Okay. The 10th version of Kennywood's 1901 Old Mill Ride, the scenes of the previous version. So, though the facade name were changed to Old Mill. Okay, so this was, here we go. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So I'm going to go through the era of what it was called. From 1907 to 1911, it was called the Panama Canal to get onto the fact that the Panama Canal had just opened to get people excited about that, okay? And then from 1912 to 1914, Old Mill Rapids Gorge. From there's a gap between 1914 and 1917, so they probably just call it the Old Mill, but then it turned into the Fairyland Floats. till 1920. 1921 to 1925, tour of the world. And so they had hung flags and things like that at that point. And then in 1925, there's a gap between 1925 and 1974. But in 1974, this is the name of that ride that people are going to that is so famous across the country that people want to go. Like, people go and have their first kiss on this ride. It's so popular. They changed the name to Hard-Headed Harold's Horrendously Humorous Haunted Hideaway.
Wow.
That's a horrible name for a ride.
That is drug inspired.
Yeah, Hard-Headed Harold's Horrendously Humorous Haunted Hideaway. And hideaway, like salacious.
Yep.
So let's get into what they do to this ride in the early 2000s that has put it on the map to the point of where people lost their minds.
So it's still in operation, or
it still is in operation.
Okay.
And in fact, in
so this is 100-year-old
over 100 years.
Year-old.
In fact, like in
amusement park ride.
Yep. And they had a redux of it during COVID. And it still operates to this day. Now they have cameras, and there is like a real person, like in a security booth as you go in, so that you know you're being monitored. Apparently, that caused people to get even crazier, and so it was known that the kids who were working the security would tape these things with their phone. And at one point, I guess there was a Reddit page or something where people were posting this, and then some people got in trouble. So. Jim Davis
of Garfield fame,
the creator of Garfield, the biggest sellout in the history of sellouts, right? Like you're like, I want to make Garfield toilet paper. He's like, I already have 6 requests. We're already working on Odie. It's Odie's tongue. It's huge. And, this guy would do anything. Like, we would put Garfield anywhere.
Yeah.
When you think about it.
If I owned Garfield, I would too.
Right? Well, and what's funny is Bill Watterson, who created Calvin and Hobbes, was approached by the same company that was handling licensing for Garfield. And I guess that there's like some famous press tour or something where he had been awarded and he called out Jim Davis for being like a sellout. Like, he's like, you're not making art, you're not making something that is pure. You're making something, you're printing your own money.
Yeah.
And he's not wrong. And I'm sure Jim Davis is sitting on a giant pile of cash.
Yeah, man.
He's like 100%.
Yeah.
So at this point, people were surprised that there wasn't a Garfield presence in a bunch of theme parks, right? Which makes sense because you got the Looney Tunes for Six Flags. I mean, the obviously the Disney characters, right? Like all of these theme parks have Hanna-Barbera was a part of. Was it Cedar Point, Cedar Falls, like all of those?
Are the Berenstain Bears still associated with Valley Fair?
I think that they are, but Valley Fair is now owned by the Cedar Falls people, so maybe that deal had already worked out. Berenstain Bears Village, I think it was.
Yeah, yep.
I mean, that was a cool experience.
I loved
Even
it.
as an adult, I was like, this is pretty awesome.
I loved it.
So Jim Davis at one point had made a deal to they were going to build a brand new theme park in the Midwest, like in Indiana, called like America's Great Outdoors, and there's going to be a whole area that was called Garfield Land. And so this is going on for a couple of years. That thing it doesn't actually get up and running. Like, they keep pushing it every year. Like, we're going to open next year. We're going to open next year. We're going to open next year. And so they decide it's time for the old mill to get refurbished. What'd be great is if we had a mascot associated with what we were doing, because when it was Old Mills Rapid Gorge from 1912 to 1914, they had made a deal with a nationally syndicated cartoon strip called Jiggs and Molly.
Okay.
And it was a husband and wife that would beat up on each other very 1912.
I'm surprised I haven't heard of it, but yeah, that sounds about right.
Right. And it looks like the cartoon looks like it's the precursor to Dagwood.
Sure. And is that back when the word balloon tails would go directly into their mouths?
Probably. Yeah, probably. I mean, at one point they have this, they also have Popeye, and so they have these they just have paintings of these characters, so when you can see some light, you see these things. But they said that was popular, and people reminisced about how great it was when they had these cartoons as a part of it. So Kennywood's like, we're going to approach Jim Davis. And Jim Davis goes, you got some money? Great. That's all that matters. Do you have some money? So they work out this deal, and Jim Davis gets paid, and they make a Odie and a Garfield walk-around character, and then they start appearing on some signage and stuff like that. But they are going to redo the old mill to be a Garfield ride. They're going to be the first place in the country that has a Garfield ride. And this other theme park that didn't get off the ground had like 12 major rides that were going to be themed around Garfield, as well as like you could go to the Mama Leone's Pizza and like, of course, get yourself some lasagna, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the classic move of why build it when you could license it.
100%. And here's where we get even deeper into this story. So Jim Davis cashes his check, and then he's like, okay, bye. He doesn't offer to create any original artwork. He has no say whatsoever in like he doesn't want to like help design the ride. He just like wants the money to go.
Hell
right?
yeah. I mean, he just, and if those were the terms of the deal, great.
Yeah. So they hire this guy who at that time had been the king of the like haunted houses. And so it's a guy who had a big background in dark rides, and he had an affinity for the old mill, and he told Kennywood years ago when he was working on a project, if you ever do anything with the old mill, I would like to take a stab at it. I would actually do it for free, to do this. So this guy's company picks up, they are told we've licensed Garfield. And so this is a Garfield experience. Fantastic. Now, at the end of this podcast, I highly recommend that you go and watch a video like ride through. One of the cool things is like there's so many rides that have been gone now, but people have uploaded like 4K amazing videos that they took when they rode through it. And sometimes I think they must have been employees because there's nobody else. Like you're not listening to other people in the ride at the same time. So the first thing that they do is this ride is sponsored by like Pepsi, Frito-Lay, and like 4 other food companies. So the first thing that happens is you get in the boat and you go around a corner. By the way, it is called specifically, it is called Garfield's Nightmare, and it runs for 15 years. Garfield's Nightmare.
Wow.
Now, I have never found that any of my beloved IP adding the word nightmare to it makes it better. For example, one of the worst video games I ever played as a kid was Bart's Nightmare, where they really had another game that they were making, but they're like, why don't we shoehorn the Simpson character into it? That game was impossible. It wasn't fun. Bart's Nightmare, awful. Garfield's Nightmare turns out to be a nightmare in itself. So you get in this boat, and the first thing you see is you go down this long hall of black. It's not black light. It's a special kind of like fabric that lets certain colors come when backlit. Certain colors come through in the spectrum better than other ones. So it looks like it's blacklit, but it doesn't require all the stuff you would need to make it blacklight, right? And it's very vibrant. And one of the colors that comes through the best is orange. So they're like, this is perfect because Garfield is orange, right? So you go down this big long thing that is simply like a picture of like the Pepsi logo and a picture of the Frito-Lay's bag. And you go down this long, it takes forever. And you round a corner and then you hear this voice and it's like, do not eat in the boat because mice will come and the mice will eat in the boat. And then you go around the corner and then you see that there is a television showing a control room with a mouse speaking into a microphone like he's the Wizard of Oz.
Got it.
And he goes, bye. The next thing you see are 3 panels from an existing Garfield cartoon, like a comic strip. Nothing moving. It's one panel, then another panel, then another panel. And it talks about how Garfield has had a lot of lasagna and he hopes he doesn't have a nightmare. It probably was a horrible like it's probably 3 panels of like a 9-panel like story, but you only get the first 3.
And these were ones that were not drawn by Jim Davis.
They were. So
they were drawn by Jim
yes,
Davis.
Because at one point
So it was just a pre-existing strip.
Yep.
Okay.
And so because at one point,
although Jim Davis hadn't drawn, he probably stopped drawing
Right.
Garfield in like 1982 or something.
so this team that's working on getting the Garfield, ride put together, reach out to Jim Davis, and he sends them a box with like 7 of those Garfield cartoon books, and that's it. like Garfield and food. And
By the way, I was obsessed with those as a kid.
And you know the shape of the
Yep.
size and shape I'm talking about, right?
Absolutely
Okay.
obsessed with those as a kid. I was obsessed too with going back and seeing how Garfield used to look versus how he was looking in like the early 90s when I was reading them.
Which is something that they had to take into account, right? Because they said, okay, well, we've got access to the Garfield IP. What version of Garfield are we going to do?
Right. And Garfield was basically this thing that got me into reading comic strips, and then I graduated to Calvin and Hobbes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's a good move.
Yeah.
You to the ones that have like an emotional depth.
It
And then
just-
at one point
it-
you went back to, was it Garfield without Garfield? Was that what it was called?
Oh my God, there's so many tangents we could go on about
Mm-hmm.
Garfield. I don't want to derail from your story, even though we're on waterlogs and there are no rails.
Yeah, well done.
But yeah, I've been thinking of all of the surrealist art that's been made of Garfield because Garfield has been so mass produced, and because there is no intrinsic storyline core to it anymore. And that's fine. That doesn't have to. It is a lazy cat who loves lasagna, and his owner's an idiot, right? That's the whole thing. And dogs are dumb and blah, blah, blah. It's the kind of thing that, you would see like a Garfield comic strip about coffee in someone's cubicle, right? Next to their Dilbert comic strip. But there are two, actually there are three different, almost surrealist projects. One is, I forget what they call it, but it's Garfield comic strips, but only Garfield's word balloons or thought balloons are taken out. So,
Right.
so Garfield is still there, but it's just John talking to his cat. Then there's Garfield without Garfield, where they've removed Garfield entirely, and it really becomes sort of this lonely man talking to no one. And it's absurd and actually
is
pretty
delightful.
pretty funny. It's much funnier than the actual comic strip. The best, though, is if you want to go down a YouTube rabbit hole, go to YouTube and search Lasagna Cat. And there's
Lasagna Cat.
Lasagna Cat. There's a YouTube channel. I don't think they've been making videos now for years, but they've got a ton of them where what they would do is they would completely reenact a 3-panel Garfield strip on a green screen with actors in full costumes as Garfield and Odie and a John. And they would down to the even how the background looks, because Davis would always kind of use like a different shade pattern on the wall in each frame. It's kind of weird. You have to look at it to see it. They would even recreate that, right? So they would completely recreate and act out that 3-panel strip. Then it would always end with the same sound effect of this like really corny canned laughter. And it would crossfade to the comic strip that they had just recreated.
Wait, what?
And then it would crossfade to, they would then take that video that they had made and they would remix it into a music video to some song, like Suicide is Painless. And then it would be trippy effects, and then they would do this weird experimental piece, and it would always end with a photo of Jim Davis.
That is amazing.
JJ, there are hundreds of these videos.
What?
Lasagna Cat on YouTube. It's the funniest thing in the world.
Okay, Lasagna Cat on
Lasagna
YouTube.
Cat.
I'm going to watch it.
Yeah. But, okay, so we were talking
Okay,
about...
so you start going through the Garfield ride, and what this does is,
we see the panels about, I hope
see
I
the
don't have a
panel-
nightmare.
right,
I had
exactly.
Too much lasagna.
so then it's scene after scene of things that Garfield torments inside of the actual comic strips that you would need a base knowledge of Garfield to get in this.
Odie, Nermal,
Yep,
John.
getting their revenge. So like one of them is, Garfield always scares the postal delivery worker, right? And so there's one where you float by and there's this like scene, and sometimes they have animatronics, sometimes it's just flat, but it's done with this like lighting thing that looks really bizarre. Sometimes they look 3D, sometimes they look 2D. So it's literally like, we'll just kind of throw it out there. There's one where there's a dog that has Garfield in his mouth, and so his little legs are kicking, and that's it. There's one where you see Garfield's big eyes looking into a mouse hole, and it's all the mice, and they're getting ready to cook Garfield.
They're getting ready to cook him.
They're getting, because it's Garfield's nightmare.
Yep,
right? Then you go into, and like John's weird girlfriend, like the veterinarian nurse.
What is her name? She's the vet. She's the vet.
Yeah. She makes an appearance from time to time.
What is her name?
Like there's one where she has a giant syringe.
I want to say they do eventually become a couple. Yeah. Like he pines for her and he's such a loser that she's not interested. But I don't know how far they explore that.
Yeah, but like
on again, off again.
And he dates other women, but they all seem to look exactly the same as she does.
Is it Susie?
I don't know.
It's bothering me because I used to know this.
So one of them is there is a kitchen scene where John is like distressed, doing that like on his heels, kind of scared. And there is a hot dog that looks like Frankenstein that's about 7 feet tall that like has a face that's grimacing. So it looks as if the hot dog's coming to life to, terrorize Garfield. And probably the most disturbing thing is in that one, Odie's tongue has been ripped from his mouth and has been used to tie him up. So his severed tongue.
Damn.
It really right. So, and then at the very end, the not the person who does Garfield's voice from Garfield and Friends, which would have made sense, but a different person doing that Garfield voice says, "Look up, you're gonna have your picture taken." And sure enough, there's a thing that takes your picture in this boat as you go. Garfield fans, they don't like it because the artwork, while it is very close, is not the artwork from Jim Davis and like the people who had been producing Garfield at that point. It was close, but not completely. The only original piece of stuff is at the very end. There's another 3-panel comic strip talking about how that was so like that nightmare was so scary. They should turn that into a crappy ride. And that was like the thing, right? Like, so they made this original piece, this little comic strip for it. Garfield fans disappointed. Old Mill fans disappointed, but they're like, we don't care. We're going to still make out. Now, though, the big difference is there is enough lighting effects in this that it's not quite as private as it used to be. Okay. Right? So people are still making out and going to town, but like it's not the how do I put this? It's not as horny as it used to be, right? For all these people. So this opens to massive disappointment from people, but it still is something that they're going to, and it lasts for 15 years. Damn. They don't do any upgrades to it. So when you were talking about how people took Garfield comic strips and kind of changed them. Mm-hmm. So at one point, the white behind like Garfield's eyes, those all started wearing away. So they didn't go in and replace it. So Garfield had these giant black orbs, like looking like a demon, hence actually making it scarier than it's supposed to be. And in 2019, Jim Davis and his estate fully sell the IP of Garfield to Viacom.
Okay.
And so
how big of a deal was that?
Oh, it must be massive, right? Because now, like, if we thought Jim Davis was going to pop this, this character on some stuff, Viacom is even better at it. So, and it's why we've seen like the crappy animated movie that just came out. Which is wild
because, you can't imagine that Garfield's popularity is as high as it was at one point, but maybe I'm just wrong about that. But the audience has just shifted to like really, really little kids.
And I think that's what it is because apparently he is a staple on Nickelodeon now.
Okay.
So they've really dumbed it down.
I need to refresh my Garfield knowledge for sure.
Yeah. They just included Garfield in a game that they launched that has a bunch of, it's like a fighting game, and so you can have Garfield as one of the characters in it, like a battle game type thing. So
is that the one that like Shrek is in?
No, because that'd be Universal. So Viacom.
I thought it was DreamWorks that did Shrek.
Yeah, but that's owned by Universal.
Is that okay?
Yeah. DreamWorks is their is the Steven Spielberg, Kathleen Kennedy, and SKG. Who's the G? Anyway, it was their production company for animation, and so Universal owns that.
Got it.
They also did all the like the Cat in the Hat. So Viacom says, well, you can continue having this ride, but the licensing fee is going to be enormous. And so they were like, no, we don't need that. So they announced that they do this like mini documentary. Like the Kennywood itself does this mini documentary about the old mill, like getting footage, like restored footage from 1917 and stuff like that.
Cool. That's awesome.
It is cool talking about it. And then in the middle of this documentary that they put out, all of a sudden it's like, and coming in 2022, the brand new old mill experience, hyping up this new refurb that they're doing into the old mill. People still go to it. It's still like something that people love at Kennywood. Oh, I forgot to mention this. So Kennywood has had a mascot this whole time, and it's a kangaroo. Don't ask me why, but they've got a kangaroo. So when they add Garfield and Odie, the kangaroo mascot doesn't come out quite as much. So on opening day of Garfield's Nightmare, they have this big thing, and so you can ride with the guy in the Garfield suit or the guy in the Odie suit, but the boats weren't big enough to accommodate the kangaroo suit. So there's a video of them at this grand opening of the guy like essentially saying like, I'm sorry, Kenny the kangaroo, you can't go on, you're too big. And he like looks down, and I'm like, I think he's legitly sad. I think that he knows that he's been something has upgraded bigger and better.
Yeah, these abstract characters, I think at some point generate a life of their own.
They do.
And you
they
actually are letting
feelings.
them down.
So this is the story of Garfield's Nightmare and how the old mill, a salacious log ride, becomes known across the globe to so many.
So okay, it's been rebranded now.
Yes.
What is it now? Like what is the theme now? And is it as horny as it was?
It still remains as like the horny thing. It is now just called the old mill.
Yeah, that would be the call I would make.
Yeah,
too. It's just calling it the old mill.
And they brought back the Western skeleton theme.
Okay.
So now when you go through, it's like old dead horses pulling wagons and shootouts and stuff like that.
And are they doing like you can buy your photo for $40 or things like that?
I'm sure they are.
Yeah.
I'm sure they are at the very. I mean, once you get that equipment up, that stuff, like in the digital era, like why wouldn't you, right? Like, oh my God, you're just printing your own. I just bought a picture of Jill and I riding the Mummy ride at Universal Studios because I heard that they're closing it and that's not going to be up. And it's an interesting ride. It uses black lights to be the thing that scares you. And the CG in the two scenes that they have CG are like real bad. They're like, what was the Mummy spin-off? Scorpion King, where people couldn't watch it. It was like the CG was so bad. So I bought one of those and it was like $25. And the guy was like, this is a really fun photo. And I was like, really? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, do you mind? Would you sign this waiver? And so we signed a waiver so that they could take that photo and then use it as a promotional photo going forward. And it's because I look terrified and there's little kids behind me who are like, yay!
You know what I just thought of the other day? One of my favorite stories of yours is the Dairy Queen hot dog eating competition.
Oh, I love that one.
Could you please, could we end today's podcast on a brief retelling of that story? Because I think about that story every once in a while. Usually when I pass by the mall, it'll come up in my head and I get a lot of joy out of it.
I'm going to guess that the year was the summer of 2003 because I was living in an apartment with Phil Lund and Cody.
Yeah.
And
03 or 04.
Yeah, one of those, right? Like around that time.
I think I was out of high school at that point, so probably 04.
Okay, 04. So I got a call in mid-May from a friend of ours who had worked. She started working at the Dairy Queen in the mall when she was 16. She still works there. She's the manager, and she's been the manager for a long time. And Terry says, "Hey, listen, my boss is reading a lot about hot dog eating competitions, and he wants to get a hot dog eating competition going here because he thinks it'd be great publicity." And she's like, "But I need people to sign up for it. So would you sign up for it?" I said, "Sure, no problem." I totally forget that I agreed to do this. And a month later, because they wanted to have it like leading up to the 4th of July. So it was maybe the week of the 4th of July. Terry called and she's like, "Are you coming or what?" I said, "Coming to what?" And she's like, "Today's the day of the hot dog eating contest." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So I make my way to the mall and I walk in and I kind of expect a stage, a step and repeat, something like that. There's nothing, but there are 2 tables near the Dairy Queen that have been blocked off. And so I show up and I asked Terry, I was like, "Well, how many people are competing?" And she goes, "We didn't have anybody else sign up, but there's some people in line that I convinced to do this as well. So I sit down at this table, and on the other side are 3 children. And when I say children, I mean 3 kids under the age of 10, the youngest probably being maybe 6 tops. And the littlest one looks at me and he goes, I hope you're not hungry. And I find out that they are there. They're at the mall with their babysitter. And it's free to sign up, by the way. Free to sign up. And there's a prize of $100 in Dairy Queen gift cards to the person who can eat the most hot dogs.
Imagine that. Like, you get home from work and the baby, you're like, so what the kids have for lunch? And the babysitter says they had a hot dog eating competition at Dairy Queen.
Here's the irony. So they were in the line to order Dairy Queen, right? And this woman's trying to convince them to be in a hot dog eating contest. She's like, oh, okay. They had already eaten a lunch. Like, they had eaten like a kid's chicken strip meal. So these kids had already eaten. So I get there. They bring out a tray of, no joke, 50 hot dogs. All like hot dogs in buns, like all sitting there ready to go. And I go, okay, well, like the first 2 kids take a bite, like they didn't even finish a hot dog, right? And I realized, like, this is my competition, like 100%, like I don't have to do anything. And so I eat like a hot dog and a half, and I win the inaugural Dairy Queen hot dog eating competition. And then I'm able to start like handing out hot dogs to people. I'm like, hot dog for you, hot dog for you, hot dog for you, hot dog, hot dog, hot dog, hot dog. And it was amazing, and I won the $100. Now I did give each of the kids $10, so I did hand off some of the gift cards to them, but there wasn't the pomp and circumstance that I think Terry was expecting from this competition, and I still put that on resumes.
Oh God!
Like when people are like, "Oh, this," and I was like, "Oh, and I'm the Dairy Queen hot dog eating competition."
I love
winner.
every part of that story. You know what I think I love the most is this Dairy Queen deciding, you know what we need to do to get more publicity is this, and then just completely fail at
Right.
And basically, they just set $100 and some hot dogs on fire.
I think that I think that it was one of those situations where I tell people this all the time. I take this piece of improv advice that there is fun on the other side of yes, right? So like the yes and idea with improvisation. And I lived a lot of my life just saying yes and finding out what happens.
You know what though, JJ? There's also a lot of joy to be had on the other side of no.
Is there really?
You should try it sometime.
You think so? But here's the thing. Let me ask you this. Do you have a story that you laugh as hard at, that you think back as fondly, that is something that you said no, and like on the other side, no? And I'm not saying that there isn't. Trust me. I honestly get wistful for those early days of the pandemic when no one's even inviting me to places. I have to go do an improv show tonight, and it's made all week long. I've been like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to drive and do this thing.
Having evening plans almost universally bums me out until I'm in the middle of those plans.
Right, and then it's good.
Then it's fun, but all day long, I'm like, I'm already to the point of looking forward to it being over, so I can just relax for the day.
110%. Well, I'm glad that we could talk about Garfield's Nightmare, an Old Mill Horny Ride, and Dairy Queen's hot dog eating competition. That's going to wrap it up for today's show. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to help us continue to produce new episodes each week, visit jjmeetsworld.com, where you can donate to our Patreon, pick up some swag at the merch shop, or follow our link to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, all the sites the cool kids are using these days. JJ Meets World is produced every week by Tucker Lucas. You can find out more about Tucker's work by visiting moonbasemaria.com. If you want to get in touch with your host with the most, check out linebenders.com, where you can find direct contact info for JJ or booking information. If there was a ride themed after me, it would be just a bunch of movie quotes yelled at you, but they're not 100% correct.